As we embark upon a new year and continue to traverse the passage of time, it's almost inevitable to find ourselves reflecting on the past, often arriving at the same conclusion, that the present pales in comparison. Many of us, as we grow older, share the same sentiment, that everything just sucks now, and that sports don't really feel the same anymore. And everything was just so much better last decade. So let's all take a collective journey back and see if there's any truth to that. And turn a hand back on the clock to see what was going on in the NHL and the hockey world around this time. From all the unforgettable playoff moments, the groundbreaking records, the accomplishments, the pinnacle of international competition among the best on best, all of the heartfelt farewells, and the ushering in of a new era with the introduction of the next generation of NHL hockey stars. 2014 was a crazy time to be a hockey fan. So what actually happened in 2014? Let's delve into the captivating tapestry of moments that defined an era of the hockey world. Starting off in the Atlantic Division, we've got the Buffalo Sabres, and they had an alright 2013. Mainly down the stretch though, when coach Ron Rolston took over for longtime head coach and Sabres legend, Lindy Ruff. It was now believed moving forward that Ron Rolston would be the guy for Buffalo. Well, things didn't exactly go as planned. Rolston only lasted 20 games in 2014 for Buffalo, and he would eventually be replaced by head coach Ted Nolan, who would stick around a little bit longer in Buffalo. And not much would change. Buffalo would finish the season with 21 measly wins, and they didn't even have a winning month. Fans had to deal with an organizational facelift and a teardown of the entire roster this season. And I'm sure the Sabres fans that actually stuck around and watched this team play this year, it probably felt like you guys were watching an ECHL team posing as an NHL team every night. In 2014, the Sabres had guys like Tyler Ennis and Cody Hodgson leading the way in scoring, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. This team only scored 157 goals all year. Tyler Myers at the time was by far their best defenseman. The Sabres would also say goodbye to their franchise players Ryan Miller and Thomas Vanek, two of the last remaining players from when the Sabres were actually a good team, signaling the end of an era in Buffalo, but also ushering in the beginning of a new one. Hope you guys know the meaning of the saying, patience is a virtue. 2014 was a very strange year for the Florida Panthers. Despite only being 2 years removed from a playoff appearance, Florida was bad this year. Finishing 7th in the Atlantic Division, they found themselves at the bottom, but secured the draft lottery win. Florida had a very weird goaltending tandem that would have been one of the greatest of all time if this was 2011, with Tim Thomas and Roberto Luongo. Tim Thomas decided to return after taking a 1-year hiatus, and it was obvious he was never going to be the same. Luongo would actually finish the year pretty strong after he was famously acquired back from Vancouver for Jacob Markstrom. Despite the miserable season, there were some silver linings, with the emergence of a promising young Jonathan Huberdeau and Sasha Barkov showcasing his potential, but it was obvious Florida still had a lot of work to do. After experiencing the most heart-wrenching conclusion to a season, the Toronto Maple Leafs faced a challenging 2014, finishing 6th in the Atlantic Division. Despite high expectations and a busy offseason, the Leafs' 2014 season would prove to be another disappointing one. After acquiring Jonathan Bernier and David Bolland in the offseason, they would also infamously sign David Clarkson. Leafs were looking to get into the playoffs in back-to-back years. With the likes of Phil Kessel, JVR, and the young Nazem Kadri leading the offense, the Leafs had no problem finding the back of the net. It was keeping the puck out of the net which proved to be their ultimate downfall. That and the decision to sign captain Dion Phaneuf to a 7-year, $49 million extension. And to the surprise of nobody, this contract backfired. However, there would be one bright spot from 2014 for the Maple Leafs, as the Leafs appointed Brandon Shanahan as the team president in April, commencing the beginning of the Shana Plan, and the Leafs would begin cleaning up the mess brought on by Dave Nonis. In the summer of 2013, it was the Senators who were orchestrating major moves, like flipping Jakob Silfverberg for Bobby Ryan, and shockingly parting ways with longtime captain Daniel Alfredsson in the offseason. The Sens emerged as a formidable bubble team in 2014, despite narrowly missing the playoffs. Craig Anderson would reclaim the crease when it was clear Robin Lehner wasn't ready just yet. Yet from the ashes of change, a new era emerged. The young guns led by Erik Karlsson, Kyle Turris, Mika Zibanejad, all leading the way and giving fans hope for the future. And with rising stars like Mark Stone, Mike Hoffman, and Jean-Gabriel Pageau all making their debuts this year, it was clear that the best was yet to come. In their inaugural year in the Western Conference, the Detroit Red Wings witnessed the iconic Original Six team gracefully stride into the playoffs for the 23rd consecutive year, securing a commendable 4th place finish. Under the guidance of a seasoned Mike Babcock and the revered leadership of the legendary Henrik Zetterberg and Pavel Datsyuk, the Wings continued their long-standing tradition of excellence, crafting yet another impressive regular season. The 2014 Red Wings, comprised of talents from half of Team Sweden, showcased their prowess throughout the season, notably the acquisition of former Senators captain Daniel Alfredsson, who surprisingly made the move from Ottawa to Detroit that summer, which would just add more skill and experience to an already skilled and experienced roster. Yeah, Detroit pretty much dominated the early 2010s and 2000s. It didn't matter if the Red Wings were in the East or the West, they were going to find a way to make it into the playoffs, and always find a way to put a solid product on the ice. I've got to admit, it kind of felt like the Montreal Canadiens' year in 2014. With their remarkable performance securing 100 points and clinching the 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division, the Habs emerged as a formidable contender, boasting a well-balanced roster that combined youthful talent, seasoned players, and inevitable veteran leadership. Their robust defensive core played a pivotal role in propelling them to the 6th position in the league for goals against. And of course, at the helm of all of this is the legendary Carey Price. Guiding the team with his unparalleled skills, PK Subban continued to shine, building off of his Norris Trophy winning performance from the previous year. The addition of Dale Weiss and Thomas Vanek at the trade deadline further fueled their momentum, leading to an exhilarating run. And notably, this marked the final year of Brian Giunta's captaincy in Montreal, as he would later depart for Buffalo the following year. The Tampa Bay Lightning, a team that has managed to maintain its top-tier status for a decade. They are also the only team in the league that is still being coached by the same man, as John Cooper would take over this season. However, the 2014 season presented numerous challenges for the team. Despite finishing in 2nd place, noticeably Steven Stamkos faced the infamous leg break that sidelined him for most of the season. But challenges and beefs nobody wanted to see internally within the organization would surface. When Lightning manager at the time and Team Canada manager Steve Yzerman decided not to name Marty St. Louis as a member of Team Canada. Marty St. Louis is a beloved Lightning legend at this point in his career who just came off an Art Ross Trophy win. Marty obviously felt some sort of disrespect towards Yzerman after being left off of the team. I mean, how could you not? That was his own GM basically telling him that there are other players I'd rather have on my team than you. To make things even more awkward, Yzerman would end up having to name St. Louis as a part of the team due to the Stamkos leg injury, leading to an ugly breakup as St. Louis would request a trade that deadline, and he would get dealt to the Rangers for captain Brian Callahan in a crazy captain for captain swap. The season also saw young players like Ben Bishop, Victor Hedman, Andre Palat, and Tyler Johnson all step up in Stamkos' absence. Those two guys, Palat and Johnson, were both nominated for the Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year, but the most outstanding rookie actually turned out to be a young Russian talent by the name of Nikita Kucherov, who made his NHL debut that season, rocking the legendary 56. And of course, Boston would emerge, finishing 1st in the division and winning the President's Trophy, winning everything but the Stanley Cup in their past 10 years. Of course, they would win the President's Trophy atop of the NHL in almost every category, and famously after choking away the Stanley Cup in 17 seconds the year prior. It looked like Boston was on a revenge mission this year, especially after trading away stars like Sagan in the offseason. The team really had to prove themselves, and they did a good job of that. Let's head to the Metro, starting from the bottom, where we find the New York Islanders in last place. Islanders made minimal moves during the offseason in an attempt to secure a playoff spot for the second consecutive year. Opting for the veteran presence of Evgeny Nabokov in goal, they traded for Thomas Vanek, only to have Vanek express his desire to leave after sacrificing longtime Islander Matt Moulson in a first rounder just to get him. That's gotta be a piss off if you're an Islanders fan. That transaction, along with the ongoing narrative of John Tavares carrying the team with limited support, would pretty much be the only memorable things on Long Island that year. Slightly above the Islanders, the Carolina Hurricanes had a rather forgettable year. Despite the emergence of promising young defenseman Justin Falk, the season was marked by the ill-fated signing of Alex Semin to a questionable deal. As it appeared, he just lost all motivation after putting pen to paper. The team was led by some players who might have slipped from your memory, such as Eric Stahl, Nathan Gerby, and Yuri Talusti. Bet you haven't thought about those names in a while. It was clear the Hurricanes still had a long way to go before they were considered playoff regulars. The Devils were notably led by the ageless wonders of Jaromir Jagr and Martin Brodeur, both at the age of 41 in 2014. During this period, the team found itself in a peculiar situation. Despite reaching the finals in 2012, they faced challenges with key losses such as captain Zach Parise in the offseason of 2012 and Ilya Kovalchuk in the 2013 offseason. Consequently, the team wasn't really in a position to tank and undergo a full rebuild just yet. Instead, they maintained a level of mediocrity for much of the decade, finishing 6th in the Metro that year. And honestly, I don't think this team would have been as bad if they had managed to keep some of those players around. Still had a very solid defense and most of that core that went to the finals in 2012. This would also mark the memorable final year in New Jersey for Martin Brodeur, the winningest goaltender and arguably one of the best of all time. Regardless of any team allegiance, it's hard not to feel a little bit emotional watching Marty walk off the ice in Newark for the last time. Despite boasting the decade's premier goal scorer, clinching his 4th Maurice Rocket Richard trophy as the league's top goal scorer, the Capitals found themselves in a state of limbo, displaying a rather lackluster performance despite the presence of some of the league's finest players. However, the Capitals' fortunes were about to change, because they were just a bounce-back season from Holtby and a few young stars away from really doing something special. This year, we were also introduced to players such as Evgeny Kuznetsov and Tom Wilson. So yeah, this was just an off year for Washington. The Sergei Bobrovskys finished 4th in the division and they were back in the playoffs for the first time since 2008. And yeah, I know, the Jackets had a really strong year. It wasn't just Bobrovsky. But man, this guy was different in the early part of the decade. This proved to be a highly successful year for the young emerging talents on the Jackets, such as Ryan Johansson and Cam Atkinson. However, halfway through the season, they experienced a setback all too familiar. They had a star player who no longer wanted to play there, this time in the form of Marian Gaborik. And just like Jeff Carter's tenure in Columbus, Gaborik also decided he'd rather play in LA than Ohio. Nevertheless, Columbus would maintain its form all year. Oh yeah, they also made one of the biggest splashes in last year's free agency when they would sign Nathan Horton to a 7-year, $37 million deal. A contract that would sadly go down as one of the worst of all time, playing less than 40 games on his contract before ultimately retiring due to injury problems. The Philadelphia Flyers secured the 3rd spot in the Metropolitan Division, continuing their pattern of alternating between playoff appearances and missing every other year. The team faced a handful of challenges in 2013, notably marked by turmoil, particularly the lingering impact of the tumultuous contract and subsequent buyout of the eccentric Stanley Cup champion Ilya Bryzgalov. Despite Bryzgalov's quick charm, his time in Philadelphia proved to be more of a distraction than actually benefit the team. So I think it's safe to say the Flyers were happy to move on. In the midst of the previous season's chaos, the Flyers made a significant move by parting ways with longtime head coach Peter Laviolette just 3 games into the season. However, the team managed to turn things around, fielding a solid roster featuring top scorers such as Claude Giroux, a prime Wayne Simmons and Jacob Voracek, and the legendary Scott Hartnell. Steve Mason performed adequately in his inaugural season with the Flyers after being traded for Sergei Bobrovsky. Although the Flyers had a commendable year, the unfortunate trend of missing the playoffs in every other year persisted. This marked the beginning of a downward trajectory for the team, setting the stage for further challenges in the seasons to come. The Rangers maintained their position at the top of the NHL standings for most of the decade, led by the best goalie of our era, King Henrik Lundqvist, with a balanced blend of experience from the newly acquired talents like Marty St. Louis, Rick Nash, along with the youth of Derek Stepan, Chris Kreider, and Brian McDonough. New York had once again constructed a team poised for a deep playoff run, and a decade later, it's gratifying to see that they're still reigning supreme. In the Metropolitan division, leading the charge were none other than Sidney Crosby and the Penguins, unbelievably led by the same core they have to this day, in Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and Chris Letang. Not to mention they were being backstopped by one of the best goalies to do it, Marc-Andre Fleury. Previous pickups from years past, such as James Neal, were having really strong years. And overall, the Penguins were determined to showcase their prowess and eager to prove themselves, following a disappointing Eastern Conference Finals sweep from the year before. This was also Crosby's first injury-free season since 2010, and it was awesome to have the face of the game back in action. Hockey just wasn't the same without the kid in it. Heading into the playoffs, the Eastern Conference had an intriguing setup, especially considering it was the first year of the NHL's new playoff format. The President's Trophy-winning Bruins were set to face the 4th-place Wings, while the 2nd-place Lightning were geared up for a matchup against the 3rd-place Habs. Other matchups included the division-winning Penguins against the Jackets and the Flyers against the Rangers. In 2014, due to the unique collaboration between the NHL and the NHLPA, there was no All-Star game. Instead, the best players participated in a best-on-best world tournament held every 4 years to determine the top nation globally. This marked the last time NHL athletes were able to compete in the Olympics. And it is an actual crime we have yet to see the best players of this current generation compete against the best in a best-on-best tournament like this. The 2014 Olympics held in Sochi, Russia were memorable. We witnessed some of hockey's most extraordinary moments that year. Latvia and the legendary Andrei Gudlevsky nearly pulled off a historic upset against Canada. Yeah, that's right, in 2014, that insanely stacked Team Canada, one of the best of all time, was pushed to their limits against Team Latvia. And of course, how could we forget about TJ Sochi? The semi saw Canada narrowly defeat the US, and Carey Price just outplayed Jonathan Quick enough to secure a nail-biting 1-0 win. The legend Teemu Selanne got to go out on top with a bronze medal victory in what would end up being his final bit of international play. This would set up a match between Team Canada and Team Sweden, and the best player at the time, Sidney Crosby, against the best goaltender at the time, Henrik Lundqvist. And ultimately, Canada would come out on top, repeating as gold medal winners from 2010. And if the nostalgia from this tournament alone isn't enough to make you miss NHL players at the Olympic Games, I don't know what is. Just taking a look back at the players sent to participate in the games, I can't help but look back on all the great names and just think of all the memories and nostalgia brought on by these players. Wake up, NHLPA. Let your mans go back to the Olympics already. Alright, now let's talk about the West. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't think there could have been anything more miserable around this time than being a fan of the Edmonton Oilers. This team was an absolute dumpster fire in 2014. A dumpster fire that would end up in them drafting some kid out of Germany that year. Taylor Hall had a really solid year, showing he was worth Edmonton's first overall pick back in 2010. And their second first overall pick, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, was improving as well. And, yeah, that other first overall pick, kind of a miss. But the lack of offensive production wasn't the main issue that year. It was the lack of goaltending. Well, not that they lacked goaltenders, just didn't have good goaltending. At 8 years removed from their last Stanley Cup final and playoffs appearance, this Oilers team found itself in a dire situation in need of help immediately. Well, don't worry boys, the 2015 draft is just over a year away, and there's some guy that's supposedly going to be the next Sidney Crosby. So despite the current struggles, fans were encouraged to stay patient and await for the upcoming draft, anticipating a turnaround for the team. After parting ways with hockey legends such as Jerome McGinley and Mika Kiprasov, the Calgary Flames openly embraced the rebuilding phase. Surprisingly, the reconstruction didn't extend for too long. Despite a challenging season, there were numerous positive developments. A young, relatively small player donning the number 53 had just won the Hobey Baker Award. Captain Mark Giordano was experiencing a career revival that year. It was clear Calgary wouldn't be staying down for that long. The Canucks appeared poised for a successful 2014, resembling a potential playoff contender. However, their prospects were hindered by internal issues with coach John Tortorella's tumultuous coaching stint. Constantly making headlines, notably he coached for just one season and infamously attempted to confront coach Bob Hartley during a game intermission. Yeah, you can't even make this up, man. Torts literally tried running up on Bob Hartley during the fucking intermission. Oh, dude, I love Torts. And in the lead up to the Heritage Classic, Torts decided to just make everything about him. Controversially benched goaltender Roberto Luongo, the legend himself, despite Luongo's solid performance with a .918 save percentage and a 2.38 goals against in 48 games. The decision drew ire from fans who passionately chanted "Lou" or "Boo" in protest at the game. And reflecting on the snub later that year, Luongo admitted his desire to play in the game. Acknowledging the disappointment from the situation, it took a drastic turn when Luongo was traded in a blockbuster deal 2 days later for Jacob Markstrom. Yeah, Vancouver was a dumpster fire. Enjoy the 10-year rebuild. In 2014, the Arizona Coyotes, formerly known as the Phoenix Coyotes, displayed a commendable performance and came close to making the playoffs. Spearheaded by key players like the legendary Paul Bissonnette, certified Olympic diver Mike Smith, and old man Shane Doan, along with a promising defensive lineup featuring Keith Yandle, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Connor Murphy, they showcased a level of play that surprised many. And it always puzzled me why the Coyotes couldn't replicate their success from 2012 and subsequent years. Perhaps the lack of significant changes to the team over the years might have contributed to that, and they eventually went on a gradual decline, signaling the beginning of a decline that fell much longer than a decade for devoted Coyotes fans, I'm sure of it. Nice to see that things seem to be heading in a positive direction for the Coyotes organization now, as to where they were 10 years ago. Looking back a decade later, it's clear that this team was special. The Kings boasted the best defense in the NHL, were impeccably coached, and embodied a physical and tenacious style of play, all the makings of a championship team. the Kings finished third in the Pacific Division, just 2 years removed from the Stanley Cup victory they had in 2012, and 1 year removed from a conference finals appearance. The strategic moves made by LA in the front office in recent years were evidently still paying off. In contrast, the Sharks had a stellar 2014, a pattern they were familiar with during that era. However, as time passed, it became apparent that the Stanley Cup window for the Sharks was gradually closing. Many of their key players and leading scorers were advancing in age. Despite this, the Sharks defied expectations and finished the year with an impressive 111 points, proving they still had a lot in the tank. Meanwhile, the Anaheim Ducks finished the year tied with Boston for the most wins in the league, and they emerged as an absolute powerhouse in 2014. The debut of young goalies like Freddie Anderson and John Gibson left fans optimistic about the future, while the longtime goalie Jonas Hiller was showing signs of aging. And this also marked the end of an era for the Anaheim Ducks as the legendary Hall of Famer Teemu Selanne, the Finnish Flash himself, played in his final season. In a fitting conclusion, the Ducks' last home game of the year just happened to be against Colorado and former teammate Jean-Sebastien Giguère, who was also retiring and also won a cup with Selanne back in 2007. And even for those who may harbor some animosity towards the Ducks, there was universal respect and admiration for Teemu Selanne. You can't help but not get a little teary-eyed watching Teemu Selanne and Jean-Sebastien Giguère do one final victory lap. Reflecting on the past, it's incredible how impressive the Central Division used to be, boys. It's a striking difference compared to the present, where the standings have almost completely reversed, it seems. Starting with the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets concluded with a record above 500, witnessing the emergence of several young promising players. They fell short of making the playoffs under the renewed Winnipeg Jets brand. Despite these setbacks, there was optimism for the future, and the team was definitely poised for a comeback. Midway through the season, Paul Maurice took over, and the team would see a big improvement. And had the Jets not been in such a stacked Central Division, I think we would have seen them make the playoffs this year. Oh yeah, you guys also have some young goalie prospect making some waves in college around this time. Hopefully he can make the team for you guys someday. The Predators had a formidable season, yet similar to the Jets, they found themselves competing in the toughest division in the league, and narrowly missed the playoffs by a mere 4 points. Injuries would play a significant role in this outcome, as evident by their subsequent seasons. During the healthier periods of the 2010s, the Predators proved to be a legitimate threat. And yeah, there isn't really much more to add about the Predators 2014. It was a pretty forgettable year for them, and better days were on their way. Oh yeah, but that guy they acquired for Martin Erat, he appears to be a promising addition. Claiming the 4th spot in the Central Division and clinching a postseason berth is the Dallas Stars. A team led by prominent figures like Tyler Seguin and Jamie Benn with lofty expectations and supported by Kari Lehtinen, who experienced the peak of his career this year. This roster exudes a strong sense of nostalgia, embodying the distinctive look of the 2010s era. The Minnesota Wild entered the scene with high aspirations, facing a tumultuous year marked by significant signings in Friese and Suter. 2 contracts that didn't really age the best. Unexpectedly, injuries to Backstrom and Harding paved the way for an unlikely takeover of Ilya Bryzgalov, who not only stepped up but even assumed the starting role for the team during the playoffs. The defending champion Blackhawks were led by an unexpected goal scorer in Patrick Sharp and eventual Norris winner Duncan Keith. Despite facing challenges with the late season injuries to key players like Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews, they managed to make a comeback for the playoffs, supported by Corey Crawford and their established Hall of Fame core. The 2014 season for the Blackhawks is often referred to as the almost three-peat, by me anyways, because they were on the brink of success and a single critical moment could have changed that fate for them. St. Louis would finish just above Chicago, making impactful moves at the trade deadline to strengthen their team, And despite having shaky playoff experience in the past, there was a sense of optimism this year that the results would be different. Led by guys like Alex Steen, the young Vladimir Tarasenko, Captain David Backes, the Blues made some big moves at the deadline, acquiring Ryan Miller, looking to go on a deep playoff run. 10 years later, and it is the Colorado Avalanche that are still on top. New coach Patrick Waugh had transformed this team into a powerhouse, with superstar Nate McKinnon, Semyon Varlamov, Tyson Barrie, Matt Duchene, Ryan O'Reilly. I could keep going. However, their remarkable Cinderella story in that season turned out to be an outlier, as the subsequent years kind of proved to be a challenge for them, before they would really become a really dominant team towards the later part of the 2010s. That really just shows how unpredictable sports in general can be. Colorado went from last place in 2013 to first place this year. So boys, it's Anaheim and Dallas in round 1, Colorado and Minnesota, Chicago versus St. Louis, and LA versus San Jose. Now let's get into the playoffs. Despite dropping Game 1, that never seemed to faze Boston at all, and they would take out Detroit in 5 games. Emerson Eaton would help the Anaheim Ducks avoid the upset and take out the Dallas Stars in 6 games of their series. San Jose and LA would face off in one of the best playoff series of all time. There's no other way to put it. The series saw San Jose taking the first 3 games from the Kings, only to lose the next 4 to get reverse swept in 7 games. 10 years later, and I bet this series still haunts Sharks fans to this day. What a collapse. The Tampa Bay Lightning and Montreal Canadiens had a nice series as well. Unfortunately for the Lightning, this wouldn't be their year just yet, as Ben Bishop would get injured before the playoffs would take place, leading to Andres Lindback getting the goaltending position, and Montreal kind of lit him up like a Christmas tree, and they would win in 4 games, sweeping the Tampa Bay Lightning. Funny how Tampa would get their revenge all those years later. Colorado and Minnesota played an excellent series that went the distance. We saw Nino Niederreiter, Mikael Granlund become playoff heroes for the Wild. Nathan McKinnon introduced himself to the world and the Stanley Cup playoffs, and it was fitting that a series really close like this one went to Game 7 overtime, where Niederreiter would score an absolute beauty. Playoff hockey was back in Columbus for the first time since 2008, and they weren't going to go down without a fight, collecting their first playoff franchise W in the process, and beating the Pens twice in overtime. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be enough for them, and Pittsburgh was just too dominant that year, and they would win in 6 games. Chicago and St. Louis, they would play in a highly memorable series, which saw Game 1 going to triple overtime. St. Louis would eventually take a 2-0 series lead on the Hawks. However, as the series would head back to Chicago, they would rally off 4 straight wins to take out the St. Louis Blues in 6 games. I think it's also important to note that 4 games in this series went to overtime, so it really was close and it really could have gone either way. And as for the Flyers and the Rangers, they would play in a typical Broad Street Bullies versus New York Rangers classic that would go 7 games, seeing the Rangers come out on top. In the second round between the Ducks and Kings, we saw LA jump out quick and take a 2-0 series lead. They would then amazingly lose 3 games in a row for the second straight series, only to come back and win a Game 6 to force a Game 7 where they would ultimately beat out the Ducks on their home ice. Yeah, the Cinderella Kings from 2012 were back. Now you know what I mean when I said this team's special. We would also get a nice moment at the end of this series where we'd say one last goodbye to Teemu Selanne. Back in the other conference, we had Boston and Montreal. And what more can you say? It was Boston and Montreal. It was just another classic series, which shockingly saw the President's Trophy winning Boston Bruins lose in 7 games. Where have we heard that before? In the other quarterfinal series going on between Chicago and Minnesota, Minnesota proved to be a tougher task than in years past. Ultimately, Chicago would get off to a great start and take a 2-0 series lead. only for Minnesota to come right back and tie the series at 2 apiece. There was now a best of 3 to see who would move on. And dramatically, Chicago would edge out 2 straight 2-1 victories, including the dramatic overtime winning goal in Game 6 from none other than Patty Kane, clinching another series. That's 3 now. The Penguins would jump out to a 3-1 series lead against the New York Rangers. As Henrik Lundqvist locked himself in, he was almost impossible to beat. He would pretty much change the outcome of this series single-handedly. Pittsburgh did not stand a chance, and they would end up losing in 7 games. And it really started to feel like New York might be a team of destiny this year, setting up an Eastern Conference Finals between the Montreal Canadiens and New York Rangers. In the conference finals, sadly, Montreal Canadiens goaltender Carey Price would get injured in Game 2 of that series when Chris Kreider would famously run into him. Intentional or not, this would take Price out for the series, and Dustin Tokarski would have to step up. And the Rangers would honestly dominate most of this series, and eventually take a 3-0 series lead. But Montreal wasn't going to go down so easy, and they would win 2 games in a row, forcing a Game 6. But sadly, that wouldn't be enough, and New York would take the series in 6 games. On the other side, we saw the Blackhawks and Kings face off in one of the best series of all time. My favorite, without a doubt. I even gave this series its own video because it felt like the Stanley Cup Finals was happening before it actually happened that year. This series was so damn good. The series would ultimately see Chicago win Game 1, then lose the next 3, only to come back, win Game 5 in overtime, force a Game 7, which LA would ultimately win in overtime to go to the Stanley Cup Finals. Once again, we'd find ourselves in a very low-scoring Stanley Cup Finals between 2 of the best goaltenders on the planet at the time going head-to-head in Jonathan Quick and Henrik Lundqvist. In Game 1, the series got off to an awesome start, seeing the Kings win in overtime, and the following game was honestly just as epic. And I can't help but wonder if the Rangers got a few more of these lucky bounces, we could have seen a completely different series. 2 nights later, for Game 3, the Kings would win 3-0. Quick just playing a little bit better than the King himself, Henrik Lundqvist. And in Game 4, the Rangers would finally muster off a victory and stave off elimination, winning 2-1 against the Kings. And of course, we all know what would take place the following Game 5. Alec Martinez would score one of the most iconic goals in NHL history when he would clinch the Stanley Cup for the Los Angeles Kings on home ice in 2014. Looking back on the individual awards, Sidney Crosby would pretty much unanimously win MVP, taking home 97% of first place votes. The Lady Byng Trophy saw then Avalanche forward Ryan O'Reilly take home his first set of hardware. In a very tight race for the Vezina Trophy, Tuukka Rask just edged out Semyon Varlamov. The race for the Calder Trophy was a pretty fun one too, but ultimately I think we all knew Nathan MacKinnon was going to come out on top. Duncan Keith would take home the Norris Trophy for the second time in his career as the league's top defenseman that year. Another year, another Selke for Bergeron. Another year, another Richard for Ovi. And another year, another handful of clutch performances in Game 7, ultimately helping Justin Williams win the Conn Smythe. And that is all she wrote, folks. That's what the NHL looked like 10 years ago. You know in the comments some of your favorite memories from 2014 or just this great era of hockey in general. Let me know if things really were better back then or if you think they're better now. And man, we're getting old. It's hard to believe all of this happened 10 years ago. See ya, boys.